Very good afternoon. For those of you new to these transmissions, my name is Raja Mia, and for the last approaching 5 years now, I have been campaigning against the cover up of the grooming and gang rape of children in my hometown. When I was first made aware of what was taking place, I found it genuinely incredulous and hard to believe. Yet the evidence all pointed to the same place in the same way. Children in my town had been groomed and gang raped, and the authorities had covered it up. They had systematically attempted to turn a blind eye to what had been taking place, and the individuals involved in this, those at the top of this council, were neck deep in this scandal. Their names are James Ignatius O'Rourke McMahon, who was at the time leader of Oldham Council. He is now the Shadow Minister for Sewage for Keir Starmer, the would-be Prime Minister. Alongside him was Debbie Abrahams. Debbie Abrahams attempted to have me falsely arrested, prosecuted and failed as a consequence of her clumsy attempt to manipulate some material that I published on social media. Greater Manchester Police themselves are neck deep in the scandal, having not just arrested me, but worked in partnership with an individual called Sean Fielding, who was at the time leader of Oldham Council. Sean Fielding infamously walked out of multiple council meetings rather than answer a public question about an individual called Shabir Ahmed. Shabir Ahmed was the ringleader of the Rochdale grooming gang, and as a consequence of a campaign spearheaded by myself and many of you, what took place was the emergence of information that Shabir Ahmed was a prominent Labour Party member in the town, and he was also employed by Oldham Council, where he had access to children and young people. Yes, indeed. Arood Shah replaced Sean Fielding after the people of Failsworth ousted Sean Fielding in a spectacular election defeat. Sean Fielding, in the lead up to the election, identified, singled out individuals who spoke out and attempted to have them sacked from their jobs. The police were made aware, refused to investigate. The council were made aware and tried to cover it up. Those individuals involved in the council at the time was the chief executive, Dr. Carolyn Wilkins, who has since fled the town following our campaign, and of course the borough solicitor, who still remains there under siege, Paul Entwistle. Sean Fielding was ousted and was replaced by an individual called Arood Shah. Arood Shah has a number of prominent convicted gangsters, serious criminals, as associates of hers. Her car was infamously blown up, and James Ignatius O'Rourke McMahon attempted to use the blowing up of the car and blame it on me. Unfortunately, CCTV footage emerged which showed something else taking place. It is now approaching, I think, is it 2 years? I don't know, I've lost track of time. But the Greater Manchester Police are claiming it's still a live investigation, but no one trusts them because they are not doing anything, because the evidence leads to an uncomfortable place, I think. When Andy Burnham was forced to investigate, and even his time-limited, severely restricted assurance review was forced to report that children in our town had been groomed and gang raped. Pakistani rape gangs had been operating in our town. At an explosive council meeting that Andy Burnham attended, there was 100 or so members of the public. In that meeting, it emerged that Gerard Jones, who was sat on the top bench, the chief executive of Children's Services, had been complicit in attempting to prevent victims of the grooming gangs from testifying. This is conclusive evidence. There's no ambiguity here. It's in the report, black and white. Gerard Jones had misled the investigating team. At the meeting and the subsequent meetings that followed, members of the opposition, in particularly Brian Hoban and Mark Wilkinson and their team from the Failsworth Independents, who'd been called racists and far-right activists for campaigning on this issue alongside myself, attempted to get a motion through calling for a government inquiry. The Labour Party, the new Labour Party leader, Amanda Chatterton, stood up and, before blocking the motion, claimed on record that you couldn't say that being groomed and gang raped, is what she was made in reference to, had destroyed lives. We couldn't say it had destroyed lives. I'm not sure what she meant by that, but those words, I think, will haunt her to her grave, if I'm honest with you, and I believe it will oust her and her number of her colleagues in the forthcoming May all-out elections. Now, what we have in Oldham is a senior Labour Party minister, at least one, who is complicit in this cover-up. He's complicit in the cover-up, and that's Jim McMahon. His two protégés, he had three protégés, two of them we've got rid of, Sean Fielding at the ballot box, Arood Shah again at the ballot box, and Amanda Chatterton remains, and Amanda Chatterton has been actively blocking calls for a government inquiry. On the day the report came out, the Burnham's Assurance Review came out, Jim McMahon posted a letter on parliamentary letter-headed paper on his Facebook page. It's still there. You'll see he makes reference to myself and a number of others as racists and far-right activists. And yeah, those of you who are new to this, yes, if you're looking at me, I am of the colouring I am also a Muslim, and if anything, I am a decorated anti-racist. Yet James Ignatius O'Rourke McMahon put on Facebook parliamentary letterhead calling us racists. He even paid for Facebook adverts for that letter. He then used parliamentary privilege to facilitate an adjournment debate in Parliament where he stood up and called us racist and far-right activists. Well, we now know why, don't we? We now know why. Yesterday, the Home Secretary echoed almost word-for-word language that we had been using for the last 4 years and been persecuted and attempted to be prosecuted by a corrupt police force who have been in bed with corrupt politicians and a corrupt council. Well, guess what's going to happen next?
You made a nice film for GB News where you went and investigated the grooming gang. So what do you make of this announcement today? To what extent was the fact that race and culture played a part in those crimes, to what extent will that be more tolerable, more manageable after these statements today?
Well, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, will be arriving here in Rochdale later today to meet with police chiefs, survivors and indeed child abuse specialists to discuss the raft of new plans that the government has announced this morning. The chief of which is this new task force to investigate child grooming gangs wherever they are found. I think the key detail that has been missed from this discussion so far this morning is that this task force is being supported by the NCA, the National Crime Agency, which has enjoyed so much success in Rotherham under Operation Stovehood. You'll remember, of course, that in Rotherham, the J Report in 2014 found that 1,400 girls had been abused from 1997 to 2013. But when the National Crime Agency was brought in very soon after that report was published, it's actually revised that figure up to 1,510 and made dozens of more prosecutions and convictions. And so the NCA, being parachuted in with their specialist officers to the various local police forces, should make a significant difference. And indeed, if any GB News viewers recognise that policy, it's because they would have heard it in the documentary recommended back in February. There's also a few more recommendations being made, including mandatory reporting being announced very soon, And we're also going to see more efforts on the collection of data ethnicity. Now, you've just heard from your commentator there about the issue of the Home Office report in 2020, which said that it was impossible to know the truth about the ethnic links to this crime due to a lack of available data. Well, now it is hoped that more data collection will be achieved, which will allow for a better understanding. But even with the limited data that the Home Office had in 2020, it found that British Pakistanis were vastly overrepresented in this kind of abuse.
Charlie, how does this task force operate? If there's reports of child grooming, sex grooming, does the task force go en masse to the town or city where it happens? And how big and how many people are on it and how experienced are the people who are doing the investigating?
Well, I'll be exclusively interviewing the Home Secretary later to get more details about this new task force. But in Rotherham, under Operation Stovewood, the National Crime Agency essentially took over investigations into historical child sexual exploitation, pouring in hundreds of millions of pounds to launch new investigations with hundreds of new officers, and really ventured to areas where South Yorkshire Police had failed. Operation Linden, an investigation into the efficacy of South Yorkshire Police, found gross and widespread failures. And the reason why the NCA has been so successful in Rotherham and throughout South Yorkshire is because they were able to bring in and look under stones that were previously unturned. And so in the documentary in February, we uncovered up to 50 different towns and cities where we believe that these grooming gangs have credible reports of them going on. But the National Crime Agency has only been to one. With this new task force, perhaps they will find new towns to investigate.
Okay. So the government, the Prime Minister has announced a new task force, including National Crime Agency, specialist officers. I am calling on the first town that this task force enter is Oldham. Remember, they had to be dragged kicking and screaming, and the reason they had to be dragged kicking and screaming is because of the senior political and police complicity in the cover-up of the grooming gangs in Oldham. And it is because of how high this goes. This task force should first and foremost come to Oldham and investigate. And this task force should not limit itself to investigating the cases of the grooming gangs in terms of the victims and the perpetrators. This task force should also incorporate investigations into council officers and politicians who have been complicit, because what they did should also be investigated, because in my opinion what these councillors and these council officers did in covering up what took place was criminal. I call on the NCA, this specialist task force, first intervention to be in Oldham. They will have to investigate Oldham, Pauline. They will have to investigate Oldham. Be in no doubt whatsoever about that.
It's clear that this has been a scandal that has gone on for far too long. Vulnerable girls in troubling circumstances have been dismissed, have been ignored when they have justifiably complained about sexual abuse, exploitation, being drugged or being raped. And there has been a failure on the part of state agencies, social workers, teachers, the police, to take seriously those concerns. It's on the back of this challenge and real problem which is ingrained in some of our institutions that the Prime Minister and I have now announced a series of package which take us forward, which will ensure that there's now a mandatory duty on child safeguarding professionals to report when they have concerns about exploitation or vulnerabilities. I think that will make a big difference in the action that will be incumbent on professionals to take.
We saw in Rotherham and in Rochdale, in those scandals, that government officials and police officers were not prosecuted, despite reports proving that they knew what was going on. Do you hope that with your reforms, and with mandatory reporting in particular, that an ethos and a culture of accountability will be introduced?
Yes, I think that imposing a duty on professionals will lead to a culture change, will lead to professional change. Ultimately, silence enabled this abuse. Silence on the part of professionals, fear of being called racist, fear about cultural sensitivities, fear about inflaming cohesion in communities. It is absolutely vital that we call out the truth of what's been going on, and that's why mandatory reporting is an important tool in the armoury of measures that we're announcing today.
Yesterday, when you spoke about your incoming list of reforms, you said that, I think correctly, that British Pakistanis are disproportionately overrepresented in this kind of child abuse, with one Labour politician describing this commentary as dog whistle politics. What do you make of this?
It's not racist to tell the truth about what has been going on here in Rochdale or in Rotherham or in Telford. Local reviews and reports have confirmed that the grooming gangs scandal that has gone on here has been perpetrated by largely British Pakistani men. Now, it's important not to demonise a whole community, and the vast majority of British Pakistanis are law-abiding and straightforward people. But it is also clear to say that in these towns, and I've met victims today who've confirmed as much, bearing out their own experience, that there have been cultural trends in the practices that we've seen, and authorities and professionals have turned a blind eye out of fear of being called racist. Political correctness can no longer be an obstacle to taking action.
What would you say to all the women and girls who, until now, have been too afraid to come forward with their story because they didn't believe that the police or the government would support them?
I've met some women and girls today who were victims of child sexual exploitation, and they have explained their experiences of being dismissed, being ignored, not being believed. I urge victims to have confidence in the police, in the authorities. We are leading a step change. The measures that we're announcing today, whether it's mandatory reporting, whether it's a new task force, bringing together specialist police agencies and expertise to crack down on this practice in communities, or whether it's greater data, or whether it's toughened up sentences, represents a real step forward in supporting victims. This government is on the side of victims, and I urge them to come forward. That's how we'll secure justice for them.
Remember, at the time Andy Burnham announced Operation Sherwood, Operation Sherwood has now been in operation for nearly a year. There have been no charges, no convictions, no updates whatsoever. Operation Sherwood was specifically launched as a consequence of forcing out of Andy Burnham and Greater Manchester Police and Oldham Council that children, white working class girls in Oldham were groomed and gang raped by Pakistani rape gangs, and that this information was covered up. These crimes were covered up. This is now a fact. It is a fact that Amanda Chadderton's Labour Party administration cannot get away from, irrespective of how often they have blocked calls for a public inquiry, irrespective of how often they continue to call me a racist and a far-right activist, irrespective of how many times they go after decent people such as yourselves for daring to speak out. This is now beyond them. This has tipped over and there is nothing they can do. Now, the reason why Oldham needs to be first is because this entire momentum, the momentum of all of this has come from our work. This was stalling until we came and risked our everything. We came and risked everything. And this is where the momentum came from. Furthermore, Amanda Chadderton, Andy Burnham, in that assurance review, refused to state how many of our children were groomed and gang raped. That in itself is a crime. They refuse to tell us how many children were groomed and gang raped. The report authors, Malcolm Newsom and Gary Ridgway, both of them whose careers will be over as a consequence of what is taking place, carefully developed a narrative where they claimed it wasn't a cover-up. We know it was a cover-up, and they claim it wasn't a cover-up, yet they refused to to give us a number, a simple number of how many of our town's children were groomed and gang raped. Furthermore, Operation Sherwood, Andy Burnham's Operation Sherwood, the first action it did, the first thing it did was go and visit someone known as Child A in that report. And do you know what they did to Child A? Well, you do know what they did to Child A. They threatened her. They threatened her for speaking out. Greater Manchester Police, clearly, they've had a year. They cannot be trusted. They cannot be trusted. Why? Who are the groomers? Remember, this was involved a senior Labour Party politician. Can we, and in terms of Shabir Ahmed, senior Labour Party, can we be trusted? Can the police be trusted to investigate this? Can Greater Manchester Police be trusted? I do not believe they can. They've had a year. They've done nothing. They've had the best part of 2 years with Arooj Shah's firebombing of her car. What did the Chief Constable do? He gave her an award. That firebombing, these grooming gangs, all of this is linked. A criminal council, a corrupt police force, and then politicians that are neck deep in the scandal. The National Crime Agency, this task force, must come to Oldham first. It must take over the investigations, and it must also be prepared to prosecute the politicians involved. You will have noticed that there's complete silence from your council leader, Amanda Chadderton. There is complete silence from your MPs, James Ignatius O'Rourke McMahon and Debbie Abrams, because they are running. They are running scared. The government is coming for them. The National Crime Agency is going to come to Oldham, being no doubt about that whatsoever. They are on the run, and I call on every one of you to remain steadfast, remain resolute, and we promised there will be a reckoning, and that reckoning is coming. A very, very good afternoon to all of you. My name is Raj Amir. Indeed, it is right. I have an MBE. I have an MBE for safeguarding our children and our communities from extremists. And no matter what it is that they write about me in the council-funded press, no matter what they say, I think by now it's very clear how history will judge me and how history will judge every one of you who stood alongside me.
Do not fear them. Do not fear any of them.